Good evening and welcome to the Strand. I'm Yanel and I'm pleased to welcome Ariel Sabar here tonight to celebrate his new book, Heart of the City, 9 Stories of Love and Serendipity on the Streets of New York City. Inspired by his parents' story of meeting in Washington Square Park, Sabar looks at the environmental psychology of New York City's iconic public spaces and asks, could some places actually encourage people to take the first steps toward falling in love? Ariel Sabar's first book, My Father's Paradise, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Autobiography. He is an award-winning former staff writer for the Baltimore Sun, Christian Science Monitor, and Providence Journal. His work has also appeared in the New York Times and Boston Globe, among many other publications. He currently teaches creative writing at the George Washington University. Following his reading, Ariel will take your questions and he'll then stick around to sign his book, which you can purchase downstairs on your way out of the store. Please join me in welcoming award-winning writer Ariel Sabar to the Strand.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Thank you all for coming out. This is a terrific crowd. I was at the Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side earlier today. I spoke there last night, but I figured I should probably see the place. And so, and it reminded me that, immigrants of every conceivable stripe have come to New York City to search for jobs and economic opportunity, but also to find each other. I remember the inspiration for the book really was my parents, but I remember after much of it was written, that my great-grandfather on my mother's side, a man named Chaim Boris Kruger, who came from Russia in 1902, had written a diary in Russian, and we had recently gotten it translated into English. And I figured, I should probably read this thing just in case he mentions falling in love or he mentions public spaces in New York. There could be another way to sort of leverage the family story. And so sure enough, I'm reading this, and about 3 days, and he arrives in New York in 1902 with all of like 8 rubles in his pocket. And he writes in his diary the third day after he arrives that in New York City, I would like to join some noble cause for mankind or fall in love. And he winds up doing both. He meets one Dora Rubin of Brooklyn, and they wind up getting married. But one of the interesting things was when I was reading the diary, after they meet, he again, I'm looking for public spaces, and he says that we professed our eternal love for one another upon Williamsburg Bridge. So it's just this wonderful new element to the story that made me think that this stuff happens all the time, and there are these amazing stories, amazing love stories that unfold in New York City that sometimes New Yorkers I think are can be too cynical or dark to reflect on. In fact, the woman who introduced me at the Tenement Museum yesterday said that she really resisted this book because she's a New Yorker and she likes stuff that's depressing, and then I think gradually after reading it she overcame at least some of that, and so I'll talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then I'll read a little bit, and then we can open it up to questions, and if any of you guys want to share your own New York love stories, even if they're depressing, please do. It would be great to hear. So Heart of the City is a book of nonfiction love stories. It tells the true stories of 9 ordinary couples who married after first meeting by chance in one of New York's iconic public places. Grand Central Terminal, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the subway, Central Park, Times Square, and, of course, the street. Now, it didn't matter to me whether the couples lived in the city. I cared only that they met here. In fact, one divorcee, a woman from Virginia who had a young son, was in New York for all of a weekend when she struck up a conversation with a man, a German tourist, 15 years her junior, on the ferry to the Statue of Liberty. And they've been married now for 20 years. Now, though this book is largely about other people, the inspiration for it was personal and in many ways universal. It turned on a kind of existential question, and I think one many of us have asked ourselves at one point or another, and that's, how did I get here? What accidents of biology, culture, and history set us walking on Earth at this particular time, in this particular place? And there was one such accident that particularly intrigued me, but it's actually more of a puzzle. How in the world did my parents meet? My father was born to an illiterate teenage mother and a peddler father in a mud hut in the mountains of northern Iraq. My mother was the daughter of a well-to-do Manhattan businessman, and his wife. And I have these visions of like what these two sets of parents were doing when my father and mother were kids. My father's parents were probably like riding donkeys across a mountain pass and fetching pails of water from the river, while my mother's parents were like at the Metropolitan Opera fanning themselves with programs. I mean, literally, they came from such different places, and by all rights, their children's paths should not have crossed. But one fall day in 1966, they find themselves in another great public space in Manhattan, Washington Square Park, in the heart of Greenwich Village. Now, neither my father nor mother lived in New York City at the time. They were both in town just for a few days. My mother had been living upstate with a boyfriend, but the relationship was on the rocks, and her shrink, there's always a shrink in any New York City love story, suggested she stay with her parents in Manhattan for a long weekend. And she was a bit of an amateur photographer, and to sort of pass the time on the Monday of Labor Day weekend, she goes to Washington Square Park to take photographs of kind of the scruffy street musicians, the bohemians and outsider intellectuals who were sort of the regulars in the park in those days. And my father was a first-year graduate student at Yale. And he'd come a long way since that mud hut in northern Iraq. And that's the subject of my first book, My Father's Paradise, but that's another talk. And he had taken a weekend off to see friends from back home who were living in the East Village. And my father wasn't really happy at first in America. He was homesick. He wondered why he'd left his family behind. He was depressed. In fact, when he woke up that morning, he told his friends, you guys go out without me. I'm just going to stay in the apartment and sort of sleep in. I don't want to do anything today. And finally, he gets up and he wanders through the village and he finds himself in this park. And among the oddballs and misfits in the park that morning is this young, seemingly well put together lady, and she's flitting about with a camera, taking photographs of all these characters, Americans who my father didn't see in the tourist brochures. And he's sort of touched by what he's seeing, and I was like, well, what was it, Dad? And what grabbed your attention? Was she hot? And he said, oh, not really that. And I'm like, well, okay, then what was it? And he's very sweet. This man should be writing like greeting cards or something, but he said he was very touched by the fact that she was drawn to people who didn't look like they had made it in America, because he came from those kinds of people. And I'll never forget what he told me. He said, I thought that this woman saw the image of God in ordinary people, even when they aren't at their best. I mean, how do you come up with that stuff? And so he decides he approaches her with a very clunky pickup line. I think something along the lines of, "Are you also a tourist?" Which would send most women running in the other direction. But 4 months later, they're married. And the more I heard of the story, the more convinced, or the more interested I became in the role of the park itself in bringing these two strangers together. The park seemed somehow to magnetize them, to set them on a kind of collision course. In fact, my father confessed to me recently that he'd actually first spotted my mother on the street outside the park. Something was, wait, so you stalked her, and how did that happen? And he said, well, I saw her there, but I didn't feel it would be appropriate to strike up a conversation with her in the street. It wasn't until she stepped into the sanctuary, the sort of sanctuary of the park, that he felt he could say anything to her. And I said, why? What was it about the park? And he said that the park kind of shrank the city, brought it down to a human scale. Remember, my father's not a big city kid by any means. Out of the screaming rush of Manhattan, it carved out a kind of village where time ticked more slowly, and people who were strangers on the street suddenly felt familiar and approachable. I'll tell you what he told me. He said, the space was very important. The first thing I thought about when all my friends left that day was, where can I go where I can be around other people? And friendly people who are open to communication. Whereas the rest of the city was tall buildings and all the noise and subways and buses and people rushing everywhere, Washington Square Park was the opposite. Here you could just be with people without all the commotion. And I wondered what was so bad about the rest of New York, I mean, the part of New York outside of Washington Square Park. And he said, the rest of the city alienates you in a way. If you are not with somebody when walking on the streets, you feel just smaller and smaller. The park was a small place where even if people didn't know each other before, they behaved like family. And so I began to wonder again, whether my parents' meeting was fluke or fate or something in between. That question started to seem very important to me. And I wanted to know, were there other couples with similar stories? And did science have anything to say about the power of place over the workings of the heart? So I began mucking around in libraries, looking for obscure books on social and environmental psychology. I was curious whether anyone had ever actually studied this. And it wasn't all in one place. You have to sort of go following one footnote to the next, and gradually I pieced together these studies that looked at the way in which spaces and the environment can actually catalyze romance in some sense. Now, it turns out that certain kinds of places, and I don't just mean cocktail bars, do make us see strangers in a warmer light. It turns out that beautiful surroundings rub off on their inhabitants. If a place is more aesthetically pleasing, we tend to rate the people inside it more favorably. And density also matters. One of the most consistent findings across decades of studies is that the closer any two strangers are, whether in a classroom, an office, or a neighborhood street, the more likely they are to become friends or at least think well of one another. And another factor is what the urbanist William White called triangulation. Some of you may be familiar with William White. He's well known in New York City. Back in the 1970s, New York City was trying to figure out why some of the Midtown plazas were flooded with people during the day, eating lunch, meeting friends, lovers smooching, all kinds of. I mean, some were just very, very bustling, and others were barren. And the city of New York had a stake in making these plazas a success, because they had just enacted a new zoning law that basically tied the height of buildings to the allocation of public space on the ground floor. So if you wanted to go higher and higher and higher, you needed to make more of your plaza accessible to the public. Now, the building owners didn't necessarily like this, but the city of New York wanted to encourage it. And so they asked William White to figure out why some were more crowded. And he came up with many, many reasons. But one of the ones that I thought was very interesting was what he called triangulation. And what he discovered is that if you want strangers to gather and talk, it helps to give them something to talk about. A street performer, a juggler, even an odd-looking sculpture, a spectacle of some kind, it triangulates. It takes two strangers with seemingly nothing in common, and through a shared immediate experience links them, even if just for a moment. And you know what this looks like. You're watching something just sort of bizarre, and you look over at somebody else, and they're sort of looking at you, and there's this moment of recognition that you've shared something. Before that, you had nothing in common, but because of something unfolding in front of you, there's a spark, there's an opportunity. And I love what White wrote in his 1980 book, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces. He says, "It is not the excellence of the act that is important. It is the fact that it is there, and it is the fact that it is there that bonds people. And sometimes a really bad act will work even better than a good one. Many people will be looking as much at each other as what's on stage." And finally, there's this natural love potion that is adrenaline. Social psychologists have found that when we're in places that make our pulse race and get our adrenaline pumping, we're more apt to feel attracted to strangers and approach the person than we might be in less stimulating places. Now, the source of the adrenaline doesn't really matter. It can be from elation, it can be from fear, it can be from jealousy. I mean, someone might have just sort of suffered a breakup or some tragedy, or even just a good workout. I mean, it's probably not all that surprising that a lot of people meet at the gym. In fact, some of the studies even looked at couples emerging from a frightening movie versus couples emerging from a comedy. And what they found is that couples emerging from frightening movies were more likely to sort of have their hands all over each other as they walked out of the movie theater than those emerging from sort of lighter fare. So the source doesn't matter, and the Psychology Today a few decades ago had a headline that sort of summed up a lot of this research, which was that adrenaline makes the heart grow fonder. And so the science was tantalizing. You know, beauty, density, adrenaline, and spectacle. I all felt were sort of conspirators in my parents' meeting. And I think all those things are present in the best public spaces, particularly in cities. But the studies felt arid. The problem was that the experiments had all stopped at the moment of attraction. Then what? Did any of those stirred up feelings lead to a first date, let alone a wedding day? And I wanted to find couples like my parents who had basically married after first meeting in one of these great public spaces. So the nine love stories that made the cut span from the early 1940s to just a few years ago. In fact, I think the most recently married couple was married in 2009. The oldest married in 19